come in. This is week 9, 10?
Yes, week 9.
This is week 9. Week 9.
9 to 12
so
weeks.
The voice you're hearing is Megan Torrance.
Torrance is talking to everybody right now. What is she doing?
Torrance
You want to be our live translator? So.
And there's a build a business case for xAPI. That's the session today. And I just have a couple of small little slides to share with you. First and foremost, and I know Megan probably talked about this, we have our xAPI party on December 1 from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. I've put a link in chat there so that you can indeed.
She's just giving an update on upcoming events.
Yes, and their next event that we have, we want you to RSVP for that. And then we have our call for proposal, and we do want you to be a part of that. Even though you may not be a DevLearn right now, you're part of this cohort, you're creating great work. We want you to submit your work, and I dropped a link in there so that you can do that. And then finally, if you're not a guild member and you're online, please consider joining us. I'm going to drop a link in there in just a minute. We want you to join us. There's so much going on. You get a discount to DevLearn, discount to Learning Solutions, a discount. So please try and join us. Today, week 9, build a business case for xAPI with Duncan Welder. He's the Director of Client Services at Risk. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Duncan, who's live at DevLearn right now, and he's going to show us that business case. Go ahead, Duncan.
All right. Thank you, Karen. We are live at DevLearn. This is an interesting arrangement here. So I have the, Karen, if you can kill your sharing, I'll pull my slide deck up. But all right, there we go. So ta-da. All right. So, am I not?
We're just seeing lots of Duncan. I got Duncan to the left of me, Duncan to the right, stuck in the middle.
A little Steeler Wheels reference.
I don't totally live in a cave. Mostly, but not totally.
Let me figure out what is going on here, why I'm not sharing.
Now we just need others. There we go.
Got it. All right, technical difficulties bypassed now. So for those of you on the call just joining in, we've been chatting about 15 minutes here at the DevLearn conference about making a business case for xAPI and have a full room here. So Megan is going to help me navigate taking questions and watching the chat, and we're going to talk about making a business case for xAPI and look forward to any of those questions that pop in. Like Karen mentioned, my name is Duncan Welder. I'm the Director of Client Services for Risk in
Duncan,
Houston,
can you
Texas.
hide your little, your sharing little thing there? Thank you.
Had to hide my little sharing thing there for those of you that can't hear. My background is really in LMS implementation for the last, 25 years now. And we got started very early on with xAPI as an early adopter, and then jumped directly over as an LMS provider into working with CMI5. So I've spent a lot of time in this space, and glad to see it kind of evolving into, really moving into production now. I know for the folks that are on the cohort, you should be familiar with xAPI at a conceptual level, but I've talked to a couple of people here at the conference, and just wanted to give the most basic explanation for xAPI that I think of. xAPI is just a way of writing about our experiences in a consistent way so that we can report on those, gather new data. But it's really just like a Twitter activity stream that says, Duncan did something. And then you can go on and extend that to, with a particular tool, or maybe I have evaluated another person. But realistically, for keeping it simple, all we're doing is trying to keep data in a consistent format that a computer can read and is also fairly easily readable by a person. So if there are additional kind of intro to xAPI questions, we can certainly take those offline too. But again, really from our standpoint today, we're looking at how do we build a business case, and all I really want to do is to know that there is the capability of tracking those kind of those items. So with that, why is now the right time? And some of this is what we discussed in our little preamble time earlier. We've got all these new opportunities for delivering training, mobile devices. We can analyze data at larger scale more quickly than we have ever in the past. New information is generated all the time. How do we go in and do deep content evaluation to make sure that we are delivering the training that we need? And I think one of the bigger ones, even here and moving forward, is really the change of expectation for learners. It's interesting walking around the show floor this week, and there are lots of booths that are discussing, focusing on personalized training and really being able to adapt to give someone the right training at the right time, because we've all gotten used to the YouTube model of going out and saying, while I'm standing here in the kitchen, I want to take a look at how to make a béarnaise sauce and not leave like I had to do in the past. So I think that changing understanding is one that, or changing preference for training is one that's going to support xAPI too. A couple things just from a base level that are important. xAPI has a learning activity provider. So you can think of that as content or a mobile device or some kind of application that is going to send a statement to a record store. And the important thing is the activity providers can both read and write statements from that store, assuming that they have the authorization to do that. And the benefits are really being able to access new data. Again, this is a slide stolen from Megan, or at least images stolen from Megan. With SCORM, you get your completion, your duration, your score, base information there. But with xAPI, I can start asking new questions, like what specific interactions someone may have accessed there, or maybe I went to a particular page inside the online help, and that sent a statement that said Duncan did a search in the online help for whatever topic is there. So you really have much more unlimited access to designing the data that you want to get. And that's one of the critical elements that we won't chat about today, but you really do have to think about what data is valuable for capturing. So some of the benefits that I see there with the reading and writing, adaptive learning, I can be in a content module and start something that has multiple phases or lessons, and information that I put in that first module can then be picked up in the second module. So if I'm doing resume writing and I start off with my personal information in module 1, and then module 2 we're writing objectives, that personal information can be ported over. Or from a minimizing of extraneous training, I can go back and look and see if there's some kind of objective or competency that's been mastered in the past, and maybe I can either let someone test out of that content or bypass it altogether, because we have a documented case where where they've already received that and shown that they could master it. So the idea about sharing files across activities, and I say files because one of the things that a lot of times we don't think about with xAPI is you can store attachments. Right? That's part of the specification. So if I want to upload a picture inside a content module, then I could do that. It gets written to the LRS, and then maybe I have an instructor graded lesson that they come in and evaluate that image, or we just use it for documentation of experience or documentation of someone's capabilities that way. So the final things from a benefit standpoint, before we jump over into why in the world is there an uphill battle to get xAPI in place, is data portability. And I think this is ultimately going to be a big win for the IT side of the world, which everybody says, gosh, I've got to bring IT in. It's always going to be a problem. But again, the fact that I can take data from one learning record store, move it to another learning record store, to another learning record store as a requirement of the specification, again, keeps you from being locked into a particular area there. All right. Again, mobile compatibility we talked about there. We just don't operate sitting in front of a big tower computer anymore. So it's good to be able to move away and use things that are outside of the traditional, let's say, browser-based LMS. Content evaluation. This is an example of a project that a client did. They went ahead and added xAPI to each of their test questions so that they could identify what objective it supported. And they realized that they had a lot of objectives that were not being covered or not covered well, and really led them to do a reevaluation, reassessment of their training processes. If you can see on the screen capture here, these passed and failed by objective. You see your man lift aerial lift, your Draeger tube testing, confined space entry, hazards of steam. Down the side, you see this one with a great big long line across the top that says unknown. And that's really their SCORM data that's still coming in, because it just did not have that association between an objective and a particular question. So now, this is the part where we really start to get into the creative side and how we're going to provide a solution, because we can bring xAPI in from a lot of different sources. So e-readers, social networks, games, clearly online learning, performance support, mobile apps, learning management systems. As a learning management system provider now for 25 years, I think the LMS is responsible for being an activity provider. There's stuff that happens when someone registers for a instructor-led course, or maybe a supervisor approves that. Why isn't that generating an xAPI statement going to the learning record store? If you're going to think about that learning record store as the kind of holistic view of someone's training across the board versus just those LMS kind of experiences. So it's finding out where that top spot is, where you are going to begin looking for xAPI data, and what's the strategy going to be for rolling that out. So we've got all the benefits that we talked about there, but here we go. I think it's already stolen my thunder on this. It happens every time. But you guys, the first rule of xAPI is not to talk about xAPI. The second rule of xAPI is not to talk about xAPI. So again, people probably do not care about the plumbing outside of this geeky crowd.
We care about the plumbing.
They care about the plumbing. But for the most part, you've got to sell a benefit. I'm sorry, Megan, there was a question that came up while we were trying to get reconnected there. What was
the questions about adaptive learning?
Okay.
How does adaptive learning differ from recommendations, and do you know any real use cases of adaptive learning?
Okay, yeah. So versus recommendations, where I would say, people that took this course also took this course, which I find can certainly be valuable in some cases. In other cases, it just isn't, right? Everybody had to take fire extinguisher training or bloodborne pathogens awareness. It doesn't necessarily mean people that enjoyed bloodborne pathogens awareness training also chose to go to fire extinguisher training. They probably just had this handed to them. So what I'm really thinking about in the adaptive side is the content itself changing. So within a piece of content, there are a couple things that can drive that. There's some kind of past performance, right? So I've shown that I can do this, or I've entered something that changes what's going on, or it could be something really demographic, where, say, based on my my student information, what I say, my agent profile, I work in this particular area, and that means I don't need to receive California sexual harassment training because I don't supervise any employees in California, right? So being able to change some of that content really on the fly there, based on the existing data that we have.
Go for it. Yep.
All right. So who are we going to have to satisfy in this whole thing? And there are really a couple different groups here. What are the oppositions from a C-suite? What are the oppositions from management, from IT, from students, from L&D, from vendors? Because there is still some resistance there as well. The first is, you can't go in and like, hey, we want to use xAPI, right? Because the answer is no, right? I mean, why? Big deal. But if you say, I want to see what pieces of content our learners are actually using, that's something that could be valuable. Or I want to reduce our time to competency. Those are things that I can get back to a yes on, versus trying to sell technology in and of itself. So the things that the C-suite really want to get from the training group, and this will vary some, but you want productivity, you want efficiency. I want my new employees to be up to speed faster than my competition, right? So I still have the competitive advantage there. And you still, like say, looping back to that changing student demographics, as we move forward, I feel like there's going to be less and less tolerance for having time wasted with extraneous training there. So how do we get around some of those things? And then finally, there are a lot of tools that don't necessarily use xAPI yet. So, what do we do, in this interim period? And I think that's tightening up, but it does still exist. Well, my first thought, and this slide I stole from Megan ages ago, is if you think about business, we measure everything, right? Even down to this Fitbit kind of data from on the personal side. But on the business front, there's a huge amount of reporting and data that goes into sales and marketing and changing things like marketing people will look at website hits and see that if it's a weekend, they're getting more mobile hits, so they focus on mobile advertising there than desktop things. But we don't do this in training. This is the one place where we have traditionally been less than not less than transparent. That makes it sound negative. Well, we've really looked at measures like passing and failing rates and the number of people that get trained versus what that effectiveness was. What benefit did we get out of it? So, C-suite solutions, how can we improve? Or actually, we can only improve what we measure. So why don't we have some way of coming in and looking at how we're doing training and whether we need to build some kind of feedback loop and make things more efficient there. What can we do for interoperability between systems? So, in the past, it was very difficult to get simulator data back into a traditional LMS. They often lived as separate appliances, if you will. So, can we become better at what we do because we can now move that data around. And then, one just to think about, there are a lot of Internet of Things devices that will send xAPI statements. I know that uh, some of the folks there with Torrance have put in accelerometers and light meters and things. So, is there something that we could, instrument so that we can make something happen, or we record additional data from these Internet of Things devices based on what they send? From a challenges and management standpoint, it's always the time and the cost, right? I can't have people away from the job, and when they do, it's sure better, improve performance. Retention here is always that kind of slides onto the double meaning. I need to retain employees, I need employees to retain information, and both of those we want to do as much as we can to support from a learning and development standpoint. So some of the things that help satisfy those needs, or some of the critical bits that management is looking for, is, if I can put training in line to reduce time and cost, and not send people away from their job, then let's do that. And how can we use xAPI to really support the performance support side of the world? So looking at performance data, again, I can see the impact of training. I can look at it in a much closer feedback cycle, so that I can continue to improve there, and maybe continue to trim out some of that extraneous training. And then finally, what tools or processes can we use to drive retention? I mentioned the case earlier with the space learning project, where space learning we've talked about for decades now, but it's I need to get a little content, build on that, get a little more content, build on that. That can be very difficult to manage in a traditional learning environment, whether that's instructor led. You can still do it, right? You can have homework, you can have surveys after, you can have cohorts that meet and things like that, or something as simple as just emailing out. We do updates or things about job aids. How did you use this kind of information? But again, if we start looking at those kind of opportunities that help minimize time away from the desk, help improve learning retention, and keep people on the job longer, there's a real value there. From a IT standpoint, I think the big challenge is always going to be, is it safe? And we really don't need anything else to support. It's got a lower cost. Well, one of the things that that I look at from this standpoint is, xAPI really started out, as the brainchild of ADL and the Department of Defense. So from a security standpoint, it's really about the implementation. It's not that it's unsafe or safe by design. That's really how you manage the authorization and getting people into systems. But from a lower cost standpoint, definitely the opportunity to avoid having to build additional middleware if we can exchange information with different xAPI enabled systems, because again, interoperability is part of the goal. So from an IT standpoint, what solutions are there? One, support for xAPI, I feel like is easier than SCORM. You can see it where SCORM has a lot of weird stuff that just happens behind the scenes, and a lot of data that I will never touch in those SCORM tables. Lots of cloud-based options, right, which is only going to continue to grow. there are some free options for pilot projects. I know Megan has given a presentation on day hikes in xAPI, looking at free ways to get your feet wet, kick the tires, if you will. So what are the things I can do there? It could reduce integration costs in the future, and then of course talk to your vendor and your security folks on the security side, because it can be made as secure as any other database that's out there, and actually have some better validation on things. SCORM does kind of require the LMS to take anything that it sends, whether it's good or bad, where we can at least reject some invalid statements on the xAPI side of the world. This is one of my new favorite. This one and the next one. Two of my new favorite slides, and I got them from the ADL this summer. This is their current state view of their learning ecosystem within the Department of Defense. And it's all these separate systems that don't speak to each other or only speak to some other systems, and lots of different databases and repositories, but everything is completely split apart. And you really can't report without grabbing from multiple data sources. Where their direction is with their total learning architecture is they still allow people to have the systems that are best tools for their job. So they're not going to get away from having different tools. Different learning management systems is a good example there. They've tried a number of times to go to a single government LMS, and it just has never worked out. So the idea now is you use xAPI with all these tools, and you bring all that training data into a federated data stream. So I still can report on information across the entire DoD, even though each branch and then even some bases have their own databases that they're storing things in. The first thing they did with this is begin migrating those kind of higher level tools over. But eventually, the hope is everything is flowing this way into some kind of authoritative learning record store. I know we're close.
We're close. We've got some questions teed up.
Oh,
already.
cool!
Yep.
All right, then I will wrap up here in just a couple seconds. Then we'll take on the question side. But challenges from students, save me from boring training, improve my performance. Not that the student ever actually says that themselves. But then there's also a giant concern in my mind with data privacy around, especially that K through 12 are tracking training for minors. But there are so many different ways of killing boredom there. We do so much of this now. The social learning, the gaming is simulations, so many of the mobile applications and the micro learning side. And again, having that continuous performance feedback loop. So, I can say, in real time, what is the information that I may need to, or what are the actions that I may need to improve on, or what additional training might need to be done. So again, the don't spy on me. The trust relationship that exists there between training groups and their students, and from my mind too, once you get to that college, or not college, but K through 12 level, you really have to look from a legal standpoint, and also again how you'll manage that student data. So final two challenges from L&D. Why is it different from SCORM? It doesn't work with my existing stuff. If I have to talk to IT, it's never going to happen. And my LMS isn't ready. Probably things that are very true in some cases. There are differences from SCORM, being able to track additional information, but really the key there is the state of development tools. LMSs, authoring tools, LRSs are constantly evolving. These are things that we have to request out of that community. From an IT standpoint, it's much more modern technology than SCORM. So it's preferred some on that side. And then, it's time to ask providers, where is xAPI on their roadmap? If you have an LMS provider that doesn't, have a plan in place, or an authoring tool provider that doesn't have a plan in place, or custom development house that isn't, evaluating, if not actually working inside xAPI, then it's probably a concern. And the final one, it's and this is a jab back at us folks that are hanging out on the expo floor. You get the vendors that you walk up to and say, "Hey, do you have xAPI?" And they say, "Oh yeah, man, I do all the APIs." And they say, "No, it doesn't really work that way." So really, xAPI is the one xAPI to rule them all in the learning space. So that's educating the vendor population can be difficult there. But what we really want to do is minimize having a bunch of one-to-one APIs to have systems integrated. We want to use xAPI so that we can pass that information back and forth. But xAPI is getting stickier by the minute. More developer tools, more LMS, LRS applications out. So with the adoption by the IEEE to create an actual standard versus the specification of the past, I think is going to help push things forward. And then in the xAPI camp or working group on Tuesday here, the ADL announced that they're changing the Department of Defense instruction from should to shall use have xAPI or CMI5 in all learning and development technology purchases. So I don't know when that change is going to happen, but as they strengthen the language, it seems like it will only continue to move forward. So that's it. I will do some questions. Before we do that, hey, do the feedback form in the app too at some point, because that's important to to make me better and to allow me the opportunity to come back like this. So yes, let's do questions.
So
what works?
There's been a fabulous conversation online, and while I would typically go online first, they can't even hear me, can they? Well, typically go online first. They've had a conversation, and you all have had to be real quiet throughout all this. So let's go in the room. What are your questions? And Duncan, I'll just ask that you repeat the question so the online people can hear, because they can't hear it.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so what I know so far is that the LRS are usually third-party providers, and so it's kind of a business expense. Are there options for, say, open source to be able to have LRS in-house?
All right. So the question was is there an option to have an LRS in-house, or something that is not a capital business expense, in addition to what's already there, if you don't have an LMS that includes an LRS. So, and Megan, please, join in there as well. There are some systems that provide a certain, I think they're normally limited by the number of statements that they receive, but you can use a trial up to that point. The downside there, to be frank, is that it's easy to generate a lot of, especially when you're initially playing around, right? It's easy to create a lot of statements in a hurry. So that may or may not be viable for an extended period of time. The ADL does have some LRS examples that I believe are open source completely. The real difference when it comes down to selecting between LRS is, even though they should be able to do all the same things, right, at a minimum, right? They have to meet the standard. So the real differentiator is what capabilities you have for querying or reporting and things like that. So from the cohort standpoint, there is trial access am I right, to Learning Locker for the?
So Learning Locker has trial access. I mean, but basically all the major LRSs have free trial options for pilot projects. And then the further you go, the more, and the more robust your pilot needs to go, the better. Do you have an answer to this question or the next question? An answer to the question, go for it.
Analytics has a new open source LRS called SQL LRS.
Oh, thanks,
Awesome.
David.
Awesome.
That's
take,
you, Pesh, right? All right.
All right. Let's take a question from online.
Okay.
Can you ask Karen to actually, I'll ask Karen to put up Josh B's question. Josh's question is, how do you talk to your LMS provider about to help educate them about xAPI and why you need it?
This should be the most apparent thing possible to an LMS provider. I guess this is the thing that's difficult for me. I do, this is where I live. It's a difficult question. I think there's still going to be kind of two models. There are going to be LMS that include an embedded type LRS, and there are going to be the standalones that you configure to run in parallel. And I certainly see a lot of organizations that are going to have multiple learning record stores there. I feel like if it's not on the roadmap for your current LMS provider, that's a problem, both from a receiving statement standpoint and a sending statement standpoint. Now, how I get past that, I'm not exactly sure, because to me it just seems like the slam dunk decision. Why would you not play in this space?
So I'm going to ask a follow-up kind of counter question. A lot of times when I talk to vendors and I say, well, why don't you support xAPI? Because also to me, it seems like the most logical thing you could possibly do. And they say, well, first they say, well, my customers don't ask me for it. So start harassing your vendors. The second thing they ask, though, or they tell me, is that when our customers ask for it, they don't know what they want to do with it. They cannot articulate what data they want. And when they do, that can be done with SCORM 2004. Right? So I think that as you start coming up with better use cases around better data, right? If you can get it out of SCORM, that's not what you need xAPI for. Right? If you can get it out of e-learning, you don't need xAPI for that. Right? If you can't get it out of e-learning, or it isn't even e-learning, that's what you need xAPI for.
Yeah, and I would, I don't think there'll ever be just a mass migration from SCORM. Right? I think this is one of those things that happens slowly over time, but it is deciding what data you want. And if we continue to think in the very traditional launching a content module and say next, and here's a knowledge check, and next, there's probably not that much additional data that you're going to get outside of the completion and duration SCORMy kind of information. It's when you want to see how someone maybe is interacting with something more deeply, or you're using it to evaluate if people are using pieces of content. Those are areas where you can, in that traditional e-learning, get some value from xAPI. But I see things like EduWorks has a application, Pebble Pro, and one of the cool things that it does is it lets you go through and have collaborative classroom time with other people that are synchronous was their original thought on it, but it was because you're geographically dispersed, and now with an instructor going through, you can again upload pictures and ask questions, and the answers can be shared with your peers inside the class, and they can respond to those things. And that's stuff that you couldn't really do in a traditional clicking forward kind of scenario.
All right, we've got just a couple minutes. Let's take one from the room. Yes.
Can you explain how CMI5 is in the equation?
Oh, sure thing. Yeah. So the question there was, can you explain what CMI5 is or how it fits? So one cool thing about xAPI is the standard is very short compared to Swarm, which is not. But xAPI never mentions an LMS, right? So it's all about storing data. So it doesn't talk about the other, the LMS and things that Swarm did, like packaging a file as a zip, right? So you could load it, and how completion information was going to work. So CMI5 is really the profile for how that traditional online training is packaged, launched, and tracked with xAPI. So it's really using xAPI as the communication mechanism that's running below, but you get all the advantages of being able to add additional information if you want to, because the content is being written, or the interactions are being written back to a learning record store.
So if the LMS says that it supports xAPI and CMI5, what do you choose?
Oh, so if you have a piece of content that's CMI5, then it should upload either as a zip file, right, like a Swarm file would, or an XML file, because it doesn't necessarily have to have all the resources with it there. But yeah, CMI5 has their 9 rules that are unique to CMI5, and they go over the sequence and the launching, and what is the job of the LMS and what is the job of the LRS, or the content, the provider, the activity provider, to send information back and forth. So it's really the good first step, right? So we can do Swarmy stuff with xAPI.
And with that, we've come to the end of our.
Well, thank you everybody for attending this multimodal session, hybrid session. I hope to see several of you join the cohort. It's free. You can go out and do it right now. Hope to see you actually making things, doing things with xAPI, getting great tools, harassing your vendors, and maybe see you back here next year with your own presentations and your own cool things that you've been able to do. And xAPI party December 1st. So, all right.
And I want to thank people inside the box and out. Thank you, guys. I appreciate your tolerance today for sure.
Thank you so much, Duncan. Thank you to Megan Torrance, who we didn't see. And thanks for all of you online. I'm going to go ahead and end the session.
Or
All right.
xAPI
Thank you, Karen.